Hello, my name is Franklin Moss, and I want to thank everybody for joining Community Frontline today. Uh, we have our monthly forums, but as of recently, with everything that's going on and with everybody being quarantined and isolated in their homes, we have decided and wanted to do for our community have a forum every week, every Wednesday that address some of the issues that we are dealing with and struggling with in our households. So today we'll be talking about conflict resolutions. And we have two speakers with us today. We have Darryl XX and we have Joel Snead. Um, and what they'll be talking about is just kind of going over just some of the different things that we'll be dealing with all the changes, all the things that are happening, how to handle those conflicts, and how to continue to move forward in a positive way, hopefully allowing us to continue to grow together and work through the conflicts that we might have. I hope that is a good like summary of what's to come, or just a little brief, intro of some sort. So today we're going to have Darryl XX, and he is the program director of conflict resolutions in the city of Fort Worth. You can go ahead, come on in, and he'll be starting us up. As you know, we these are not going to be a very long time. We want to make sure that everybody is still able to get the information, and we're able to knock this out. So I thank you for joining us today, and come on in, please. Okay.
And let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, sir. And I'm gonna go ahead and jump out and let you take over.
Got it, got it. Got it. So first and foremost, I want to thank Community Frontline for allowing myself to speak on behalf of conflict resolution in the city of Fort Worth. I've followed you guys for the past 2 years that I've been out here, and you have an amazing platform. But I thank you again for allowing us to speak today. First off, I want to introduce myself. My name is Darryl 2X. I am the program director for the conflict resolution program in the city of Fort Worth. I also work as an associate director of admissions at Ogle School Hurst in the city of Hurst. And as I mentioned, the program director for the conflict resolution program. My passion is really in teaching conflict resolution and how you can actually build and develop your emotional intelligence at work, in social settings, and most importantly at home. And that's what a lot of us are dealing with, being at home, also being in certain social settings, as well as going to work back and forth for those of us who are going back and forth to work. I represent the 10,000 Fearless Conflict Resolution Program, which is a platform that was adopted in 2015. During the Million Man March, we were commissioned by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan to go back into our communities and make our communities a safe and decent place. The conflict resolution platform was one that I found value in it, as it's rooted in love and unity for men and women in our community. And I've seen an extreme rise in violence in the city that I was in. And I wanted to find different ways to do something about that. And this was a platform that allowed me to be able to do so. So speaking towards conflict resolution and its objectives and what it does, the program objectives is to successfully intervene in conflict by using conflict resolution. Also to work within the communities to actually reduce the crime or reduce the recurrence of crime by partnering with that actual community and creating certain resolutions to be successful in that community. To also conduct wellness checks and maintain peace through established resolution. So we know a few months ago, there was a young lady who was murdered within her home. And this is one of the agendas that was actually newly placed on there to do wellness checks in the community, which has been led by the city of Fort Worth to be able to do those wellness checks. And then finally, to give individuals viable pathways in handling conflict and preventing senseless acts of aggression. So typically every month we would meet at the Dot Bookstore, and we would do a monthly meeting in which we would have someone come in and speak about different aspects that we deal with in reference to conflict. Now, when I think about conflict, I think of the word problem. When I think of resolution, I think of solving. So those meetings are based in problem solving as it relates to financial literacy, emotional literacy, just a multitude of different things that we may deal with in our community, whether it be spiritual, physical, all of these different things. That platform allows us to bring specialists in to actually speak on those different topics and how they affect our daily lives. So our agenda for today is to learn a little bit about what is conflict, also introduce 4 types of conflict, and also introduce what is emotional intelligence, getting a better understanding of that word. And then in the end, closing with the need for resolution and why it's important. And I know after speaking with Mr. Joel and hearing Mr. Joel, who will be coming up later, he's definitely going to go in, and it sounds like he's going to build a lot on those topics that I'm also going to speak on. So going right into it, talking about conflict. What is conflict? By defining it, looking up in the Webster Dictionary, conflict is a clash between individuals arising out of difference in thought process, attitudes, understandings, interests, requirements, and even sometimes perceptions. So what are some of those drivers of conflict? Because a lot of times we don't understand what it is that's pushing us and causing us to feel and act the way that we act. So some of those things we identify as misunderstandings. And we know in a misunderstanding, that's a failure to understand something. Then we also have personality crashes. So a personality crash is where an individual may find themselves in a conflict, not necessarily with a particular issue for a person, but in having an incompatibility of a personalities or approach or a style. So not knowing how to speak to other people, how to be respectful to people when you may speak to those people, and things of that nature. Also competition for resources. We know day to day when we go to our grocery stores, there's a limit on the food that we may be able to get. You can only get 1 or 2 packs of meat. There's a limit on tissue. I would say since March and since this situation has actually started, I still haven't been able to get a regular bottle of alcohol. Nothing even special. I haven't even been able to get that. So those are issues that we're dealing with as it results or relates to conflict. Also, a lack of cooperation. We know with a lack of cooperation, typically when we think about the word cooperation, this is working to ends and working to an ends together. When we think about that lack of cooperation, this may be someone not putting that same level of effort that you may be exalting, or also they're not working to the same ends that you may be working to, which can also create conflict. And then differences in opinion. Everyone doesn't have to agree, but it's about how we go about those differences and articulate what those differences are. So those things become important. And then some of the day-to-day conflicts, and these are things that we're typically dealing with on a day-to-day basis. People with masks, people without masks. You go to Walmart, sometimes you see or hear people who are not taking the COVID virus as seriously. I know I just found out 2 days ago or the day before yesterday that my uncle was actually diagnosed with it. So a lot of people are being affected due to the ways that they are carrying themselves and not carrying themselves. Also, the capacity of living in stores. We find ourselves going to stores. There's a capacity limit. Some Walmarts, they only allow a certain amount of people, in which now you have to stand in lines and things of that nature. So those things create conflict because you become irritable. Now, depending on the weather that you may be within, those things may affect you as well. And then the lack of social distancing in public. You know, when you go to Walmart, they're typically having signs on the floor every 6 feet. But I guarantee you can look down the aisle and you'll see people who are not focusing on those things and not following those rules. And those things create conflict for the people who are actually following those rules and actually are engaging in those things. Rationing household goods. There's already a limit on things of tissue. So you may find your smaller child, you overusing the tissue and things of that nature, or even the food, overeating. You want to spread out different things that you're eating rather than eating so much of the same food. And then finally, limited finances. A lot of people are out of work. Some people have been put on furlough, so they only have a limited amount of money to be able to be successful moving forward because businesses haven't opened, and it's not allowing those families to be able to bring income inside of their homes and things of that nature. Some of the 4 types of conflict that I would like to identify for us today are things based in man versus man. When we think about man versus man, this is when a person is having a problem or a conflict with another person. Some more examples of that may be negotiating peace between neighborhoods. So that's one of the things that conflict resolution does. We intervene in street beefs. So when there's an issue going on in the community and someone may reach out that they're looking to have resolved in that situation, our platform is able to go and bring both of those parties together to see if we can find some type of common ground. That's that man versus man conflict. Typically, there's an antagonist or a protagonist in man versus man. There's a good guy or a bad guy as it relates to man versus man, and then man versus society. This is when a person is having a problem or a conflict that they're not following the rules or they're not fitting in the social norms and things of that nature. And it makes me think about, for instance, your Martin Luther King, who's speaking out against segregation. This is someone who's saying that what is the norm in society isn't acceptable. I remember last week, Mr. Q was speaking with the superintendent of Fort Worth ISD, and he was bringing up the point that there was a certain section of the city of Fort Worth that had Wi-Fi. So you had a certain amount of young men and women that were able to access that to be able to do their assignments and to be able to live a regular life by being able to interact, having that Wi-Fi. But on the other hand, you have another side of the city that doesn't. And I think that he was standing on pushing the agenda to make sure that everyone had that equal opportunity. So I think about man versus society. I relate to those different things. And then man versus self. A lot of people are dealing with a lot of things within themselves, dealing with vices, alcoholism, different things of that nature. So when a person is having a conflict within themselves, that's that man versus self situation. I even say this for myself. I was a little bit insecure today about speaking. So I kept having to go back and reference different points. And that's another example of man versus themselves, having certain type of insecurities that you may have in yourself. And then man versus nature. When person is having a problem or a conflict with something in nature, we all are affected by something right now in nature. And it's actually touching bases on man versus self, man versus society, man versus man, dealing with the COVID crisis because it's affecting us on all of these different levels. So that's something that's essential for us to understand. Then, and in closing with that, excuse me, I jumped a little bit ahead. Understanding that conflict is inevitable. Mr. Joe touched on that a little bit earlier. Conflict is inevitable. It's a part of our personal lives. It's a part of our work lives. But the biggest thing that we can do is learn how to handle those different conflicts effectively. And that'll be the key to preventing conflict and having a negative effect on our lives. But in order to do so, it's important that we have a level of understanding and that we also have tools to be able to use when we're coming into contact with that conflict that we may be facing. So then I want to go into emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is having the ability to recognize, understand, manage emotions of your own and other people. Typically, when we think of intelligence, we relate it to someone who has navigated a particular specialty in their life, a mathematician, someone who's a linguistic, into linguistics, or someone who's into technology. But there's also other aspects of intelligence that don't get as much attention as they actually should. So to give an example, we may identify someone who we identify as very smart and clever. However, that person has made a mess of their personal life, or they've acquired a fortune, but that person isn't a happy person. This person is sad. This person is lonely. Or maybe that person is a real powerful person, but they're very intolerant or they're unimaginative. So that deficit of understanding and that connection is what we actually call emotional intelligence. An American psychologist and book writer, Daniel Goleman, he developed a framework of 5 elements that I like to reference when I speak about emotional intelligence. And he identifies self-awareness, self-regulation, social skills, empathy, as well as motivation. When we think about that self-awareness, that's really knowing our strengths, knowing our weaknesses, drives, our different values, and how they impact ourselves and other people. So having that self-awareness allows you to understand who you are and the people that are around you to not let you be affected by them. And then going into self-regulation, knowing how to control and redirect disruptive impulses and moods. A lot of times during these times, a lot of us are irritable. And it may just be a simple question that may be asked, but in accordance to the expression on our faces, and or the way that we react, we may get that negative feedback. So we also want to make sure that we're self-regulating ourselves. And then dealing with social skills, having the ability to interact well with others, learning how to build rapport, for others to move in a desired direction. So if you're someone that's still working, or if you are the man or woman of the house, having a level of social skills will allow you to get the most out of yourself and other people, because you're able to connect with those people. And then most importantly, having a level of empathy. I think empathy is very important during these times, and having a better understanding of what a person may be going through and what their experiences may be, whether that person doesn't have the income in their household, they don't have that food ration, they have a loss in their family that they're dealing with, or they just don't know which way is up during this time. We have the opportunity through emotional intelligence to be able to identify and understand what that person may be dealing with. And then motivation, but not just any motivation. I think about intrinsic motivation, motivation that's a behavior that's really driven from internal rewards, something that makes you feel good by doing the right thing, not necessarily looking for rewards on the outside. So those are different things that we may deal with as it results to conflict resolution, or as it results to emotional intelligence, excuse me. So I want to speak a little bit about the need for resolution as I begin to come to a closure, but not being able to resolve within ourselves and our decision making causes us to lose time. So when we're distorted and when we don't have resolution and resolve within ourselves, and we don't have the emotional intelligence to navigate different situations, it allows us to lose opportunities. We miss deadlines. We have a lack of production. So that's something that's important to be conscious of and aware of. And also, when a person is out of touch with their feelings, anything can happen. So if a person isn't aware of themselves or the people that are around them, you're open to any opportunity of negativity coming out of that scenario if no one is in control of themselves or have the emotional intelligence of how to help resolve that situation. And then when those same people deal with conflict, it becomes hard for them to feel or give attention to other people's emotions. So you think about when you're going through different things in your life and you may become frustrated, it's hard to take on someone else's issues when you're dealing with your own issues. Having that level of emotional intelligence allows you to maybe put some of your issues to the side and take on a little bit of that person's and help them through their situation, or even that person identifying that something is going on in your lifestyle that maybe they can support you with. So as I close with this, we have to be able to solve our problems within ourselves to allow the opportunity for us to be able to develop into our higher selves or your best you. But not just that, you also will be able to get the best out of other people. So I know Mr. Joel is going to take over, and I think Mr. Frank is going to bring us back in, but I want to share a couple of references. 2 references from Daniel Goleman, his book, Emotional Intelligence, and then 3 years later, he came back with another book of working with emotional intelligence, and that's where some of the foundational information, it's a lot of information that's packed within this presentation that we don't have time to really go over, but I definitely want to reference these books as well as this article down here at the bottom. And if anyone has any questions or anything at the end, I'll make sure that I reference those. I also want to share some of my contact information for you all to be able to reach out to myself. Again, I have my name here, Darryl 2X. This is my personal line here. You also have my Facebook page at Your Brother DX. And then following our conflict resolution page on Facebook, you're able to do that as well. And if you have any emails or any questions, or if you want to connect with us, you're able to email us at Peacekeepersfw or fw@gmail.com. And then again, we do have our conflict resolution hotline in the city of Fort Worth that you're able to reach out. And that number is 682-800-2601. And that is all on my presentation. Again, I thank you so much for allowing me to speak and share conflict resolution from our perspective.
And thank you very much, Darryl. I know that we're going to have you come on after Joel talks, and you guys can kind of go back and forth. Also, if people have any questions while this is going on, there's a chat box at the bottom. Please enter your questions in there. I'll also enter in Darryl's information that he just shared, so I have that. So I'll enter that in so you can check it out and write it down at the bottom. So again, thank you. And we'll come back at the end with Darryl and Joel. But right now, Joel is about to jump in just to give you information about Joel. He is an LPCI, and he talks to people on a regular basis and in counseling. And so he'll be speaking on conflict resolutions and kind of breaking it down into also on a day-to-day basis. So Joe.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Darryl. How many of you have that old man in your family that can't hear very well? And so every time he gets on the phone or tries to talk to someone on FaceTime, he thinks that he has to scream so that everybody can hear him. If you don't know who that guy is, it's because it's you. I do know that that's me and my family, and so that's a conflict that we deal with in our household on a regular basis, because I always feel like I have to scream. And so that's something that definitely gets on my wife's nerves on a regular basis, several times a day, that she gets annoyed with me because I think I have to scream every time I'm on Facebook Live or on Zoom or on the phone or anything like that. So what I want to do today is break down the 4 different types of communication. This will go really well with what Darryl talked to us about. I think a lot of these points will support a lot of the stuff that he said. And so I hope that this is helpful for you and gives you a little bit better of an idea of kind of where you're at with the way that you communicate. And this is a form of emotional intelligence, which is what Darryl was talking about. So us being aware of the way that we tend to communicate with people and the way that other people communicate with us. And the hope and the goal is to create a healthy atmosphere for communication to happen in a good and healthy way. So before I get into the 4 types of communication, I just want to come behind Darryl and support one point that he made. He talked about conflict being inevitable. And I just want to talk about how we tend to view conflict in a negative way, whereas conflict is actually just neutral. Conflict only becomes negative whenever we respond in an unhealthy way and make it negative. Conflict can actually be resolved in a positive way, and it can be a good and positive thing. And there's typically never change without some form of conflict. And so we can look at conflict as an agent of change rather than looking at it and just automatically judging it as something that's bad or negative. We can look at that and look at it as an agent of change in order to move forward or move in a different direction with the situation. So the first form of or type of communication that I want to talk about is passive. A passive communicator is someone who so there's several things that I want to mention when we talk about the types of communication. So one is body language or even facial expression. So with a passive communicator, they will tend to look down or not make eye contact with somebody. A lot with their body language, it tends to be kind of slumped over with their back slumped and sort of a look of being defeated. They want to try and meet everybody else's needs, but tend to neglect their own needs. A passive person is the person who will tend to just go with the flow and not ever express an idea or express something that they want or something that they desire or something that they need. So those are some of the hallmarks of a passive person. I always like to use the term doormat to help describe a passive person, because they can be someone who tends to allow people to walk all over them. They tend to be neglected and feel neglected. And so I'll go into a little bit kind of where they can turn into a different type of communication later when being neglected for a certain amount of time. So that's a passive person. I'm sure many of you either are passive or know someone who's passive. A passive person is pretty easily recognizable. They want to avoid conflict. So the whole goal with being passive is to not rock the boat. The way that they avoid conflict is by not rocking the boat. And so they think if they're in the midst of conflict, someone's upset, someone's attacking them verbally, someone's doing anything like that, their whole goal is to get out of that situation as fast as possible. And so they think, if I can be quiet, if I can not rock the boat, if I can make myself invisible, this will pass by, and then we can go back to things being normal. Which in reality, things probably aren't normal. There's probably a lot of tension and a lot of underlying conflict, but the goal is to avoid that particular conflict in that moment because there's a fear of conflict for them. The next type of communication is going to be aggressive. An aggressive communicator, the body language that we're looking at with an aggressive communicator tends to be, they will look dead in your eyes. They will stand up and bow up. They'll bow their chest out. Sometimes they may be clenching fists down by their sides. They will get in your space. They are not afraid to step into your personal space, getting too close. And they will be loud and over the top. They will call names. They may curse. They may yell and scream. They may do things to try and embarrass you, to try and shut you down. And so the term that I use for an aggressive communicator is a bully. Many of us either communicate this way or know someone who communicates this way. Aggressive communicators can become violent and physically violent, but it doesn't always have to be someone who's getting physically violent. It can be verbally and emotionally violent or aggressive to try and shut someone down. So something that seems to be a misunderstanding a lot of times with people is that an aggressive person also fears conflict. Now, a lot of people will say, no, I think an aggressive person actually thrives on conflict, but I would argue that an aggressive person actually thrives on control. And they try to shut the other person down. They try to get them to run away or to leave the situation because they don't want to actually deal with the conflict. They just want to shut it down so that they can move back on to things being normal again. Now, if we think about nature, we think about two predators coming into contact with each other in nature. If there's a bear and it comes in contact with a wolf, that bear is going to stand up on its hind legs. It's going to put its paws up in the air. It's going to make itself look big. It's going to growl as loud as it can. It's doing everything in its power to try and intimidate the other predator to run away because that bear wants to avoid a fight. Predators know that if I get in a fight with another predator in the wild, I'm dead, or we could both end up dead. And so if I can make myself look big and mean and scare this other predator away, I can actually avoid engaging in this conflict and I can continue to live. So that is sort of the mindset of an aggressive person, is that they don't want to engage in the conflict. They just want to shut it down and have the other person leave so that they can avoid actually engaging in that conflict. So that's an aggressive person. The last one that we'll talk about and so there's actually four. I'm going to go through three which tend to present in unhealthy ways in relationships. And then the last one that we'll talk about is probably the healthiest form of communication, particularly in relationships. I won't say that these first three are unhealthy forms of communication because they each have their place and they're useful at certain times, but you definitely don't want to be using these regularly in a relationship because you can get into unhealthy cycles like that. And that's where conflict, and we can have this view of conflict as being negative because the way that we're working through conflict is in ways that aren't healthy. And so it typically doesn't end up in a positive way. So the third one is passive aggressive. A passive aggressive person is someone who they present different aspects of both passive and aggressive, hence the name passive aggressive. And so with the passive piece, they also fear conflict. And so they'll do things such as like not making eye contact or maybe looking down and away. but they will also present aggressively by sometimes they'll say things in an aggressive manner. Now, the difference between an aggressive person and a passive aggressive person is that an aggressive person is very direct with what they want or need, and they express that in a very aggressive way. A passive aggressive person wants to express what they want or need, but they do it in a roundabout way. So they're not going to express it in a way that's direct, and so you know exactly what they're wanting. They're going to express it in a way that sort of leaves a back door open for them, so that if the person that they approached in trying to express this is offended or upset or has some pushback, they leave this back door open so that they can kind of run and escape and not have to actually engage in the conflict. So they'll say things in a sarcastic way, or they may give a backhanded compliment, or they may be the person who will say something under their breath so that you know they said something, but you can't fully hear what they said, but they want you to know that they said something. And so they're the kind of person that will like punch you and run away, because they don't want to actually engage in the conflict. They just want to get a hit in, but then get out of there and not have to engage in what's going on. The word that I like to use for a passive-aggressive person is manipulative. They are also scared of conflict. The way that they try to avoid conflict is by manipulating. A passive-aggressive person is really good at understanding the way that people will react, which is why they're able to communicate this way. They know that if I approach this person in this particular way, they're going to respond in this particular way to me. And so that's how they treat all of their relationships. They try to control every aspect of how these different conversations and how these conflicts, they try to control the outcome of it by trying to manipulate the other people to responding in the way that they want to respond, or that they want them to respond. When we talk about these three different types, we tend to all camp out in one of these. Now, we do tend to all communicate in all these different types of ways, depending on who we're communicating with, or maybe the circumstance or whatever. Like I said earlier, these are all useful in certain times. If I'm going into boot camp for the Army and I'm getting yelled at by my drill sergeant, having passive communication is probably a good idea, because if I get aggressive or passive aggressive, it's probably going to be a bad day for me the rest of that day, or maybe the rest of boot camp, however long I'm there. So being passive is probably a good idea in that moment, but passive all the time is not a great idea. And so just like with aggressive, and just like with potentially passive aggressive, it could be useful in certain times, but we don't want to camp out there all the time, and especially not in relationships and with the relationships in our households. So the fourth type of communication, which I would say is the healthiest form of communication and is the best way for us to communicate, especially in relationships and with family, is assertive communication. Now, an assertive communicator can sometimes be mistaken for a passive or an aggressive communicator. More than likely, they're going to be mistaken for an aggressive communicator, because an assertive person, like an aggressive person, is willing to be direct with what they want or what they need. They don't beat around the bush. They don't try to manipulate people into giving them what they want or what they need. They are very direct with what they want and need. And a lot of us aren't used to that, and sometimes can become offended by it because we're not used to it. And so it can feel aggressive. But I'll tell you, the difference between an assertive person and an aggressive person is that an aggressive person is only concerned with getting their own wants or needs met, and they're willing to run over the other person in order to get those needs met. An assertive person is considerate of their own wants and needs, and also the wants and needs of the person that they're in the midst of the conflict with. And so an assertive person is willing to meet someone in the middle. They would rather both people be a little bit happy than for them to be all the way happy and the other person to not be happy at all. So there's a major difference between an assertive and an aggressive person. Now, an assertive person can sometimes be mistaken for a passive person, because an assertive person knows when they need to walk away from a conflict, particularly when dealing with an aggressive person who just wants to continue to attack and try to shut them down. The difference between an assertive and a passive person here is the motivation for walking away from the conflict. A passive person will walk away or leave the conflict out of fear because they don't want to engage in the conflict. Whereas an assertive person will walk away from a conflict because they're recognizing that as they try to engage in the conflict, nothing's being accomplished because the aggressive person is being so rigid that they're not willing to bend or move in any direction. And so nothing's happening in the conflict. And so they'll walk away because they recognize that it's a waste of time, and maybe they can come back later and reapproach the situation when the aggressive person has sort of come down out of that aggression and maybe work through it in a more rational and calm way. So just to kind of wrap up, the reason that conflict exists is because there's a need that's not being met. And so the conflict is there, and in order to resolve the conflict, so to go back to what Darryl was talking about, the conflict is that there's a need or a desire that's not being met, and to resolve it, the goal is to meet that desire or need. And so whenever we begin to communicate in these ways, it's because we're trying to express that we have a need or we have a desire that's not being met. But then as we try to communicate that, we are also driven by the fear of what that conflict might mean. What might this person think about me if I express that I need this or want this from them? How might they respond to me if I express that I need or want this certain thing, or need or want for them to approach this situation in this way, whatever it may be? So communication is all about meeting the needs of ourselves and of other people. And so the goal with conflict resolution is for us to work together to meet our needs and desires. And so we can see this as us being on a team together working towards the same goal, rather than us being on two separate teams competing to see who can win. And if we're not able to shift that mindset, then we're going to continue to struggle with these unhealthy forms of communication, and we're going to continue to see conflict as a bad thing because we're constantly trying to win rather than trying to work together to complete a common goal together. Now, real quick, just to give a little bit more on these few things that I think is helpful. So passive, aggressive, and passive-aggressive communication, all three of those forms of communication are trying to control the outcome of the conflict. A passive person is trying to control it by not rocking the boat and avoiding totally. An aggressive person is trying to control it by bullying and bulldozing someone over and being aggressive to shut them down. A passive-aggressive person is trying to control it by manipulating the situation to hopefully end up how they think that it should end up or be resolved. An assertive person is different because they're not trying to control the outcome of the conflict. They're actually okay with things breaking down and getting really messy. They're not scared of messy and they're not scared of conflict. What they are trying to control, which is actually the only thing that any of us have control over, is themselves. They're controlling the way that they respond to the situation. They're understanding that if I approach this person assertively, I can't control the way that they react to me. But if I do it in an assertive manner, what I can do is I can set the plate for there to be a healthy response. I can't control whether they respond healthy or unhealthy, but I can at least create that atmosphere for it to be more likely for them to respond in a healthy way. And so it comes down to, what are we trying to control? Am I trying to control all of these things, the outcome, the way the conflict happens, all of that, things that I actually really don't have control over? Or am I taking control of the one thing that I do actually have control over, and that is myself, regulating my own emotions, expressing things in a way that is not offensive, that's not putting other people down, or not trying to manipulate them, but trying to reach a common goal with that person. That's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for giving me a little bit of your time. Darryl, thank you so much. I feel like I learned a lot from you. I hope that this kind of came behind and supported what you said. And I look forward to any questions or comments that we might have after this. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. That was really good. Both of you guys came with some really solid information. I do have a question, but I'm not sure. Let me see if anybody else has one. But my question is no. Okay, so my question is when you guys are looking, when you know about conflict resolution and you're looking at it, and you're living your regular life, right? I know this sounds crazy, but when you see, do you recognize when you step outside of that, when you're just living your regular life? Because I mean, you're experts in these certain areas, but you know you have flaws. Is how often do you come to an understanding? Oh, I'm stepping outside of how I should act in regards to these certain things. So I don't know. Just let me know.
Joe, you want to take that first, or I can?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, and then you can answer after me. Yeah, so I'll say for me, a lot of our communication style is dictated by what was modeled for us growing up and what we saw, how we saw people communicating, whether that's in the home or a friend group or church or whatever. And so for me, the way that I tend to communicate naturally is passive aggressive. I grew up seeing passive aggressive communication, and that's kind of my tendency. And so over the last few years, as I've been growing in emotional intelligence and doing some work on myself, I've had to notice that and begin to move more towards an assertive communication style. And in the beginning, it has to be really intentional. But there are times, I mean, there was a time maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago where I noticed it had been like 2 weeks and I was being super passive aggressive with my wife and just in family situations and stuff. And I had to come to that realization and then bring it up and be like, yeah, my bad. I've been acting crazy. Right. And then begin to kind of move away from that. But yeah, so for me, passive aggressive is where I tend. And then if I can't manipulate a situation, then I'll go aggressive. And so I'll get loud and up and stuff. And so that's kind of where I naturally am. But I have to be really intentional to focus and try to be assertive as often as possible. But yeah, we all fall into our tendencies a lot. And so I think it's just being aware of it and being able to make that shift when you start to notice that you've kind of gone back into a more of a negative style of communicating.
Definitely. I definitely, as Joel was presenting, all I could do was smile on my side. And you see me started writing things on the inside, but all I could do was smile because I could see myself in so many different avenues in there. And most importantly, I mean, you think about someone who may be ambitious as myself or you to present information, to go out and teach. We have an opinion typically. We have an idea of what we're thinking. So being assertive in expressing what our ideas are typically isn't an issue for us. And then walking into being passive aggressive is very easy because you already have an idea typically. You're not distorted in your own thoughts as other people may be. So it's easier to come off in a sense of I know, I understand a lot easier when you are that way. So just listening to that about being passive aggressive, I found so many opportunities in myself. But Mr. Frank, awareness is the biggest tool that you can use. And that's why I talked about emotional intelligence. If you've never been introduced to these different concepts of thinking, that's the reason that giving a definition of it is so important. And I think it was beautiful how we started with the defining and giving small examples, but then Mr. Joe came back and he broke down even more and went into that because, yeah, we have a solid foundation, but there's also more within it. But again, if you don't understand what those issues are that you're dealing with, it's easy to walk into your day-to-day life and be one way and continue to knock over things and not even pay attention or even realize it, or have that hindsight to even go back to correct the issue. I'll say while I was doing the presentation, my wife is very loving. My wife loves me. Beautiful, beautiful feeling, right? My wife always wants to come and give me hugs and kisses while I'm working or something like that. And, you know, I'm like, look, babe, I'm trying to have emotional intelligence. I understand what you're doing, but you also see what I'm doing too, right? So the opportunity for both of us is to come together and, hey, maybe you don't spend so much time around my neck. Maybe you come in, get what you want, and you get up out of there, right? But that's what that awareness does, right? So I would say that just like basically what he was alluding to, you're going to deal with these issues in your day-to-day life, but having an awareness, having those tools in your bag is what's going to allow you to be more successful than not.
So let me ask you a question. So, you know, this Friday, we're supposed to come out of isolation a little bit more and return into a society that's supposed to be more open and dining again, right? So using the awareness tool of understanding, and then also using some of the things you spoke on, Joel. Darryl, let me ask you, how would you go about it with everybody having their different beliefs on how they should move, face mask, gloves, all this type of stuff? Seeing a friend that you're really close with out, or y'all, you know, however, and trying to interact properly, but not being passive on allowing how that person feels about everything, and not and being aggressive at the same time about how you feel. You understand what I'm asking?
I would say, well, first and foremost, I mean, I appreciate what the state is trying to do and open back up. However, in my family, I'm going to encourage us to continue to kind of stay to ourselves a little bit longer and gather things. But what I've graduated to is the elbow. I used to work in fast food, and you couldn't slap five, so when you would want to embrace somebody, you hit them with the elbow, to kind of show a little love or whatnot. But what I'm going to do typically is I'm going to just address it. I mean, as you were talking, I'm thinking if I had to use one of the words that we use, I probably would become aggressive. Like, what are you doing? You're not taking care of yourself. You're not taking care of me. You're not taking care of anyone. Wearing the mask and doing these things in concern of social distancing is showing a level of consideration that you have for other people, and that's important. So I would look at that person. And again, I mentioned when I was in Walmart, there are people that are standing by people, knowing what's going on. So what I would do in that situation is I actually would try to move myself away from that situation to protect myself from them and to protect them from me, because I don't want to have to let a stranger know that they're violating me if I can realize it already.
But the reason I asked like a friend, because it's one thing when you're talking to a stranger,
yes, sir.
But then it's a whole nother feel when you're talking to somebody that's your friend, like for real. And it's
get it raw.
And it's a little bit more difficult to be aggressive with a friend when you love them. You know what I'm saying? So
you know how to talk with love, Mr. Frank.
I do.
You know how to tell your family which way is up, the right way.
But sometimes if it's a certain family member, if it's a certain friend, I can be a little passive on certain things, and I think I'm not the only person that gets that way. Like if my mom wanted to give me a hug for her safety, I'd be like, hey. But my mother wouldn't do that because she's smart. So, well, I'm not saying, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
so,
got you.
Joe, did you have anything you want to throw in there?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, just like what Darryl said, I think that everybody has to make a decision for themselves and their families, kind of how they're going to move forward with this situation. So just because things are opening back up doesn't mean we have to go be there. And so my family has kind of decided the same thing. I think we're going to wait until the end of May before we actually make any decisions to start moving back towards normal, right? Being in public places often and around people and things like that. So I think that's the first thing, is like making that decision for yourself and for your family. And then two, I would say boundaries are a big thing, and us being able to verbalize our boundaries. So it's funny because in our society, we're all really uncomfortable with verbalizing boundaries with people, even though we all have boundaries, but we don't ever verbalize them, and people cross them, and then we get angry because they crossed our boundaries, but we never verbalized them, so they didn't know it was a boundary. And so it's just this weird communication where it's like, I have this idea, but I just expect you to read my mind and know the way that I expect for you to act around me, but I've never told you how I expect you to act around me.
And that's not fair.
Right.
That's not fair to anybody.
Right. And so when we're willing to begin verbalizing the boundaries that we have, it actually helps your relationships, because then people know what you expect. And so I'm not having to read your mind about what you expect from me whenever we come into contact with each other. I'm going to know that whenever I see Darryl, we're going to do the elbow. I'm not going to try and shake his hand and give him a hug, right? Because he verbalized that I do the elbow, right? And so us being able to verbalize those things with friends or strangers, of like, let's say we're in a public place and someone's standing too close, either I control what I can, which is myself. So maybe I take 3 steps back to not be so close. Or if I don't have that option, maybe I ask the person in front of me, hey, would you mind stepping forward a step or two? I just feel like we're a little too close right now and I can't move backwards. Right. And so approaching it in a way where you're expressing what you feel like your need is, without doing it of like, I'm telling someone to do or what to do or be bossy, or whatever. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I think that that information goes way further than just what we're talking about. Speaking your boundaries and stating what they are, and that goes a long way in all parts of your life. So I think that's some really solid advice. We don't look like we have any questions.
I got one.
Okay,
I got one sent privately to me. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to respond to this, but then Darryl, I think you could probably have a good response to this as well. So it says, do you have any words on mediation? So recognizing these styles and trying to help others resolve conflict. So yes, I do. First off, I know a really good counselor that people could come see. And then secondly, I think just learning about these styles and being aware of them is, because as you learn about them, you'll begin to recognize them and you'll see them in other people. And so I think just that knowledge, just the base knowledge of it, gives you a leg up on being able to handle conflict in a more healthy way. Now, obviously it takes practice and it takes repetition, just like anything. We're not just going to flip a light switch because we learned something and be able to completely change the way that we communicate. But when we become aware of it, we're able to recognize when we're communicating in an unhealthy way and try and shift into a more healthy style of communication. And we also see that in other people, whether they're communicating with us or someone else. And so I think that it does give you the ability to sit down and walk with people through communication. And I think mediation is a great thing anyways, because typically a mediator is removed from the conflict emotionally. They don't have a horse in the race. And so they're able to help the people that are in the midst of the conflict navigate it in a more calm and rational way, because they can kind of point out the things that are being said of importance and not getting caught up in the emotional aspects of whatever's happening in the conflict. So
you mind I think I'm probably going to stay around where you are, but do you mind kind of restating that question again for me?
Yeah, so it says, do you have any words on mediation? recognizing these styles when trying to help others resolve conflict.
So basically the value of a mediator doing that
Right.
type of, definitely. And as you mentioned, in some of my classes, I do a little example or a game called I Say You Draw. And what I do is I have two people sitting back to back. I have one person with with a drawing, and that person has to tell the other person on the other side of them exactly what it is to draw on another blank sheet of paper. So as those two are dialoguing, they can't look at each other and they can't see what is going on. So I have them do that for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And then after that, they actually turn around and they show what it is that they drew. Now, at that point, they're able to, they're going to have their conversation. Well, I said go this way, and I told you up, and I told you to draw a triangle. Then the second time we do it, we have a third person that's able to stand between the two and also help them deliver that message. Now we go back at the end and we look at what does that picture look like after that dialogue. And that person is able to say, okay, well, now I understand because he didn't explain it like this. He didn't say stop sign. He said octagon or something, those type of things, and those differences are very important. But again, having that person in the middle is essential because that person is typically unbiased. You want that person to be unbiased to either one of you and to give you good guidance towards a positive resolve, especially if you're looking to get away from a negative resolve. So I think that, again, having a mediator is very important if you are open to sharing those issues that you're actually having. Aside of that, continuously learning about emotional intelligence or different type of communication styles is important. And that's the reason I reference those books by Daniel Goleman, to look into those books as opportunities to learn more about emotional intelligence. And I'm sure that Mr. Joe can find some things that he can reference back. But again, the more tools you have in your bag, the more success is going to allow you. And that's in anything that we endeavor in, not just conflict, not just communication, but anything it is in our lives that we deal with day to day.
So I got kicked out, so I missed everything that you guys said, but I'm sure it was golden.
Definitely.
So I can't see any of the things that were in the previous chat. So if you can scroll through there and let me know if y'all see any questions that we might have missed, because I want to make sure we don't miss anything.
It looks like the only question that was there was from Mr. Dante, which was that question that we just answered. Everything else is pretty solid.
Yep.
Okay. So did you guys want to wrap up, or did you have anything additional you wanted to add before we finish up?
I'm pretty solid. Again, I would just encourage you to continue to study, continue to learn. Understand that we are not all perfect and that we're all in a process of development. But as long as you're within that process, that's what's going to allow you to have more successful days than not, in contrast to if you continue to deal with problems and things of that nature from where you are. So if you take where you are and you continue to try to deal with your issues without seeking outside guidance, without reading, without studying, or without someone imparting new information into you, that could be a part of a conflict in itself. So I would say continue to strive for knowledge, wisdom, and understanding in reference to emotional intelligence or conflict.
Thank you.
I would encourage everybody to be pursuing growth and emotional intelligence. I think the more we begin to learn about ourselves and our tendencies and the ways that we react and respond to things, the more control we have over ourselves. And that also leads us to being able to have better and fuller relationships with people, because we're not constantly burning bridges and offending people and hurting people's feelings and doing things like that. And so I think going into it with the posture of being a student, recognizing that I don't know everything, I still have a lot to learn, and with that posture, being willing to just continue to grow and learn about yourself and about others, and ways that you can continue to be better for yourself and for others. I would reference the assertiveness workbook. That's where I get all my information from with communication. I'm not sure who the author is. I don't have the book on me, but it's just called The Assertiveness Workbook, and it is great. I mean, it's everything that I taught about is in that assertiveness workbook. It goes through the 4 different types of communication, and then it also, I believe, has some different resources in the book that you can use to do different activities and stuff to grow in your ability to communicate in an assertive way.
And Darryl, I believe you just looked that up.
Yeah, I was about to drop it in there. It looks like the book is by Randy J. Patterson.
There we go.
The Assertiveness Workbook, How to Express Your Ideas and Stand Up for Yourself at Work and in Relationships.
Yep.
And it's a very long title.
Definitely.
But that's it. The Assertive Workbook, as Darryl 2X said, the Assertive Workbook, How to Express Your Ideas and Stand Up for Yourself, Work and in Relations.
$10 on Google Play.
By Randy J. Patterson. And thank you for looking that up. We have your information, Darryl 2X. It's in the chat. So if anybody needs it, we always hope that everybody can jump in, not jump in, can get that information through there. If you need anybody's information, just let me know. Joe, can you go ahead and give your information as well?
Yeah, you can reach out to me at jsnead. Actually, I'm going to put this in the chat so it'll make it easier.
Okay. And I really appreciate you guys joining us and giving us that solid information on conflict resolution. Sincerely, I hope that people can take this information and play it into everyday life and not just on certain things, because this is a way to kind of review yourself and see where you have played, what type of role you've played in your life, and how you can to move forward in the future. So I really appreciate everybody and just recognizing awareness 100% too. So thank you. And I appreciate you guys coming out, and I'm gonna kind of take y'all off screen, and then I'm gonna give some last information on Community Frontline. But really, I appreciate Darryl 2X and Joe Snead for coming out with us. Just the last a bit of information. We just want to make sure that people know that Community Frontline, we'll still be doing forums on a weekly basis. Fridays, we still have the Google Hangout. It's a team hangout, and we'll have the information. So on Fridays, we go somewhere get local food. We join up on this team meeting, and we just talk about what's going on in life, the things that we're going through, quarantining, and just really a Google Hangout for the most part. We do still have response teams, and we have that information on all of our social media outlets. We do encourage people to support local restaurants. Even though everything, as we mentioned earlier, everything is opening up Friday, every company or every restaurant or every place is not opening up their dining area. A lot of these companies still have curbside and will have pickup, but they will not be moving forward with the opening. So make sure you contact these local restaurants. We will have a list up so you can know who's still moving and who's still going to be doing curbside and pickup. We also want to make sure that everybody who's returning back home, returning back to work, go back safely, practice clean skills, sanitizing, washing hands. If you do wear a face mask, wear a face mask. Community Frontline will be passing out face masks to local businesses and to retirement homes and Presbyterian shelters. So if you would like to donate and give to Community Frontline, we will have outlets on how to do that. You're welcome to go to our website, www.communityfrontline.com. We thank you for doing that. Everything that comes in goes straight out. We don't get anything or keep anything. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, please contact us about conflict resolutions or anything further. I am Franklin Moss, one of the co-founders of Community Frontline, and I thank you for joining us today. and just attending. And I hope that you were able to get something out of this.